Mark or his wife to what
For the Frost Wolves.
Detective Long and his partner immediately went downstairs and confronted Mark's wife about the attic. Like, what's going on up there? Why are our business cards on your altar? But Mark's wife, the second that attic was mentioned, went silent. She refused to speak about anything to do with the attic. And so after a minute, realizing this conversation was going nowhere, Detective Long and his partner called for backup. And as they waited for backup, the two of them stepped away from Mark's wife and began speculating, like, is this a cult? Was Mark a part of a cult that ran it out of his attic? Like, what's going on here? And are we being targeted by the cult? Is that why our names are on the altar? A few minutes later, backup arrived, and they would do a much more extensive search of the property. But other than finding more pornographic materials and, bondage gear, there really wasn't anything else substantive that connected Mark or his wife to what happened to Mark, or what Mark was even doing in this house. Was he in a cult? They didn't know. And so ultimately, Detective Long and his partner told Mark's wife, who still is being quiet at this point, that she should not leave town because they were going to follow up with her soon. Now, in fairness, Detective Long couldn't tell if Mark's wife was being silent and not talking about what was going on in her house because, she was complicit in some way in what happened to Mark, or if she was maybe being threatened by somebody and she was afraid to talk. They didn't know. But either way, after leaving the property after the search was over, Detective Long and his partner felt like their next move was to try to learn more about cults. They needed a cult expert. And it just so happened there was an occult bookstore very close to Mark's house. And so they decided they would start there. And right away, their decision to go to that bookstore paid dividends, but not how the detectives expected. It would turn out the owner of that bookstore was indeed a cult expert. But much more importantly, and relevant to this case, was that the owner happened to personally know Mark Foster. And he told the detectives that Mark came to his bookstore all the time, and also the owner said he knew a bunch of Mark's friends. And so by the time the detectives left the bookstore, they had learned a little bit about cults, but more importantly, they left with a list of names the owner had given them of known associates of Mark Foster who maybe were involved in whatever was going on in Mark's house. And so maybe they had information about what happened to Mark. The detectives were able to track down everybody on this list very quickly, and they were all young people in their 20s. And in each of the interviews they conducted, each of these young people were very open about being in what they called a religious group, that they said Mark was a part of as well. Now, the detectives theorized that this religious group was very likely a cult, like they believed, but they didn't call it a cult, they called it a group. But the detectives didn't let up. They kept pressing these people until eventually a new name surfaced, Greg Freisner. Now, none of these people said Greg was in charge of the cult. Instead, they just sort of said, well, talk to Greg if you want more information about our group. The detectives naturally began to wonder if this Greg person was the cult leader, or maybe he was Mark's killer, or maybe he was both. But regardless, it seemed pretty apparent that they needed to talk to Greg because he might have more information about what happened to Mark. It took a few days, but the detectives were able to track Greg down, and they brought him in for an interview. And boy, oh boy, did Greg have a story to tell. Based on what Greg told the detectives, here is what happened to Mark on the day that he died, July 18, 1997. On that day, Greg Freisner met Mark Foster at Mark's home. And when Mark came outside, he was dressed head to toe in white, something he would do for special ceremonies. And so Mark, he came down the steps, didn't say a word to Greg. They went to Greg's car, Greg hopped in the driver's seat, and Mark climbed into the back seat. And before long, they took off and began driving northeast. And for hours, these two just drove in total silence. Mark just stared out the window, and Greg focused on driving. The only thing that happened during this multi-hour-long drive was at some point Mark pulled out a piece of paper from his coat pocket and he wrote something on it, and then after staring at it, he kind of smiled and tucked it into his shoe. And then a little bit later, Greg pulled over on the side of the road in Douglas County, Wisconsin, on this random backcountry road. And as soon as they pulled over, again without saying anything, Greg and Mark got out of the car and they went around to the back of the car where the trunk was. And the two men are kind of stretching, it's been a long drive, taking in the scenery, and then before long, Greg pops open the trunk. And in the trunk is a rifle. Neither men have any strong reaction to this. Greg just reaches down, pulls the rifle out, and Mark, calm as can be, just begins walking over to the side of the road, to the shoulder. And then once he got to the shoulder, Greg came over and stood right in front of him and just looked intently into Mark's eyes, looking for the signal. And at some point, after Mark kind of composed himself, he nodded at Greg. At which point Greg raised that rifle, placed the barrel directly on Mark's chest, and fired. Mark crumpled to the ground, and he laid there for a second just moaning horribly, and Greg just stood over him watching until finally Mark went silent and died, at which point Greg casually went back to his car, got inside, and drove home. The only time he stopped was to throw his rifle into a nearby river. But once Greg got home, he was overjoyed because he knew the sacred ritual he had just carried out with Mark had been a total success. It had gone exactly to plan. It would turn out Mark Foster was absolutely a member of that religious group, the cult, if you will. Except he was not just a member. He was the cult's leader. And Mark is the one who orchestrated his own death. However, Mark did not view his death as him actually dying. Quite the opposite.
We celebrate life as we celebrate death. Death is nothing to be afraid of. Death is a great crossroads. A change in attitude, a change in longitude, a change in the way that we perceive our spirit. When we reach that portal, they'll ring some golden bells.
He believed that what he and Greg, his most devout follower, were going to do, this sacred ritual, was after Greg fires the shot into his chest and ends this body's life, that his soul, his consciousness, and his power will be transferred into Greg. Basically, his soul will go into Greg. And Mark believed once this transfer happened, that basically he would be immortal, that his soul would never die. It would stay in Greg and then maybe at some point get transferred to somebody else, but basically he would be here forever. The bizarre note that was found in Mark's shoe, the note that he wrote and stuffed in there, that note was designed to throw police off the trail. He knew that he was having Greg murder him, again for this ritual, but he wanted to make sure Greg didn't get caught. And so he wrote on the note, very specifically, Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey. Those two people he hated. He hated that they had been in past relationships with his wife, and they hated him. And so he figured if he was going to create a scapegoat for his murder, who better than his romantic rivals? They had nothing to do with it. He just named them in that cryptic note to get them in trouble. As for all the pornography and bondage gear that was found inside of Mark's home, well, that all played a role in Mark's cult as well. He was a firm believer that the more sex he had with his followers, often multiple followers at the same time, the more powerful he would become. As for the detective's business cards found on the altar up in the attic, those were very likely placed there by followers of Mark, so members of the cult, in an effort to potentially, thwart their efforts to solve the case. They might have believed that by placing those on there and performing various rituals, that somehow would prevent them from solving the case. We don't know for sure. That's the theory around why they were there, but obviously that didn't work because the detectives solved the case. Greg Freisner would ultimately be found guilty for playing a role in Mark's death. He obviously was the trigger man, and so he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As for Mark's wife, although she definitely knew about the cult and may have been a participant, there was never any evidence that actually connected her to Mark's murder, and so she was never charged with any crime.
An American submarine, L2, was hurrying to assist a Portuguese freighter, which had been torpedoed near Padstow, when she had encountered UB-65 sitting motionless on the surface. As Lieutenant Augustine Grant prepared to give the order to sink the unsuspecting enemy vessel, he paused momentarily. Through his binoculars, he could see that the German submarine was already listing heavily to one side in the water. He could also make out the shape of a solitary officer standing up on the ship's deck, apparently staring out to sea. Before his excited men had even finished loading their submarine's torpedo tubes, Grant observed UB-65 suddenly shake, violently, as if she had been hit by a huge explosion, before she sank beneath the waves. For the next hour, the American vessel sailed back and forth, searching for survivors, but there were none. The haunted submarine had taken her entire crew down with her to her grave, and almost 90 years would pass before she was ever seen again.
So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, well, check out all of our Ballin Studios podcasts. We have the Mr. Ballin podcast, Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and our newest show, Redacted. All you have to do is look up Ballin Studios on whichever podcast platform you prefer, and there you go. You have hundreds of hours of strange, dark, and mysterious content to binge. Thank you all very much. Until next time, see ya. Okay, we just wrapped up the 15-city live tour. Like, literally, this is my first day back in the studio. The tour was amazing, really. It was awesome. It was so good to meet the fans of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious in person. That was really cool. But I knew there was one story I had to tell, first off, once I got back in the studio, and it's the one I'm doing right now. It is the final story from the set list from the tour. So if you didn't see the tour, well, you're in luck. You're seeing the best story of the tour. Now, technically, we briefly covered this story like 4.5 years ago. However, it was terrible. I went back and looked at this video, and it was just poorly put together. It's like really short, and so many of the key parts of the story were just omitted because I didn't know what I was doing. But now I sort of do, and this story was completely broken down, restructured, rewritten, and the end result is this totally horrifying, like, encore story from the live tour that I really think, even if you've heard the OG before, you're gonna love this one. This one, by far, got the biggest reaction from the thousands and thousands of people that watched this live. Okay, so this is called What's in the Basement, and it's really good. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button you're going to gift them tickets to my first ever live storytelling tour, but don't tell them you got them tickets that are mid-row floor seats to the Indianapolis show. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the fall of 1986, Frank Bowen, along with his two daughters, Tina, who was 15, and Karen, who was 9, they experienced just a terrible loss. So Frank's wife and the girl's mother suddenly passed away from cancer. And so that in and of itself was obviously tragic and terrible, but what made it even worse is that, she had been a working mom, and her income was a vital part of just making ends meet in the Bowen household. And so as soon as she passed away, as much as Frank just wanted to be there for his girls to help them grieve the loss of their mother, he really couldn't. He started immediately having to pick up all these late night shifts at his job, again, just to make sure financially the family was whole. And so it's like within days of the mother passing away, Frank is out late at work, and these two poor girls are just stuck at home by themselves, just totally grief-stricken and alone. And so in October of that year, on one of those nights where Tina and Karen were home alone and their dad was out working late, these girls, you gotta remember, they desperately miss their mother. All they want is to just have one more interaction with her. They can't believe that she's gone. They were so close with her. It's like their whole lives have been turned upside down. And so on this night that they're home alone, putting themselves to bed, they start talking about how, man, I just wish there was just a way to communicate with mom. And at some point, one of the girls says, wait a minute, maybe there is a way to do that. So the girls owned a Ouija board, and a Ouija board is basically a way people believe they can speak to the dead. It looks sort of like a game board. It's got letters and numbers on it, and it's got a yes and a no on there. And there's this thing called a planchette, which is basically like this little free-floating dial, almost like a pointer that you place on the board. And people that use the Ouija board will place their fingertips right on the edge of the planchette. And they will literally just say things like, if there are spirits in the room with me right now, give me a sign. And in theory, if there are, the spirits will move the planchette around so that people have their fingertips on it, but they're not controlling it. And it will move around the board and land on yes or no, or spell things out or give numbers. It's just a way people believe they can speak to the dead. And so Karen and Tina are like, why don't we get our Ouija board out and have a seance? Let's try to communicate with mom and see if she manipulates the board and gives us a sign that she's here with us. And so Tina and Karen, they get their Ouija board, They go down into the basement of their house, they lay it out, and they put their fingers on the planchette. And after a minute, one of the girls is like, "Hey, Mom, are you here with us right now?" And they have their fingers on the planchette, but nothing happens. So again, the girls kind of wait a minute, and they try again. "Mom, if you're here with us right now, please, anything, just move it even a little bit. Show us you're here with us right now." Nothing happens. And so over and over and over again for over an hour, the girls just sit there asking every combination of question they can possibly think of to try to elicit a response from their mother, who they so want to believe is like with them right now, sort of looking out for them. But no matter how earnestly and passionately they asked these questions, the planchette never moved. So the seance didn't work. And so the girls, it's not clear if they literally believed they were actually going to get a reaction from their mom, but, this was pretty disappointing. It was like another reminder that, Mom really is gone. And so they packed up their Ouija board, very frustrated, and they went upstairs to their respective bedrooms on the second floor of the house. They climb into bed and they try to go to sleep. So their father is still out at work. He won't be home for some time, and the girls know this. They know that they are home alone until they fall asleep. And so they're laying in their bedrooms, it's totally dark, it's quiet, and as they're laying there, the girls begin to hear a tapping sound coming from somewhere in their house. Now, it was clear to them that the tapping was not coming from the floor of the house they were on. It was coming from somewhere either on the first floor or maybe down in the basement. But, at first, the tapping sounds didn't really alarm them at all. It just sort of sounded like, house sounds at night. The sound of machines whirring or clicking, or maybe branches outside striking the side of the house, or who knows what. But they seem sort of like harmless sounds that you would expect at night. However, as the tapping sort of persisted, it wasn't really consistent tapping sound. It was more sporadic, but it was consistently sporadic. Like it was obvious whatever this was, it wasn't stopping. As that continued, the girls began to tune in more and more to it and started wondering, like, what is this? And at some point, the younger of the two girls, Karen, the 9-year-old, she started to get spooked. The sound was kind of freaking her out. And so she got out of her bed and she left her room. She goes down the hallway. She comes into Tina's bedroom and she goes up to her big sister and she's like, "Do you hear that tapping sound?" And Tina's like, "Yeah, what is that?" And so the two girls, they leave Tina's bedroom together. They go out into the hallway. They can still hear the tapping. It's kind of coming from downstairs somewhere. And the girls, they walk to the top of the stairs, basically looking down the stairwell that wraps down to the first floor. They can't see the first floor. They can only see, the halfway point, the landing. And they're hearing the tapping sound coming from somewhere down there. And the girls are just kind of listening, not really reacting. At some point, one of the girls says, "Wait a minute. What if this tapping sound is Mom? What if the seance we did worked? What if she is here and now she's giving us a sign that she's with us right now? What if it's her?" And so feeling sort of excited all of a sudden, one of the girls just says, "Mom, is that you down there?" And immediately there's a response. Tap, tap, tap. Something from downstairs is reacting to their question. And the girls are psyched. This is what they wanted when they did their seance. All they wanted was some interaction with their mother, and they think right now they're getting it. They're talking to their mom. And so after getting that tap, tap, tap response, one of the girls asks another question. "Mom, if it's really you, give us another sign. Really show it's you." Tap, tap, tap. Something for sure is interacting with them downstairs. And the girls 100% believe it's their mother, and again, they are thrilled. And so the girls, they start walking down the stairs, firing off more questions to their mom, and even though some of their questions weren't really yes or no questions, they would always get that sort of tap, tap, tap response. Like, again, something is interacting with them. And as they made their way down to the first floor, and they're hearing this tapping, and they're sort of following it around, it eventually brings them to the head of the stairs that leads down into the basement. And they open up the basement door, and they're asking more questions, they're getting those tap responses, and it's clearly coming from downstairs. And even though the girls are really excited, it's gotta be Mom, they weren't so confident that they were prepared to go down into the basement to follow after this tapping sound. So they sort of stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down into the basement. It's gotta be Mom, but it's still a little bit frightening to go down there. And so they stayed there right above the stairs, looking into the basement, just constantly asking questions and getting responses from down in the basement from Mom. It was great. And eventually, after, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever it was, the tapping just stopped. The girls continued asking questions, but there was no longer any reaction from the basement. And so at that point, the girls, they're so excited. They really feel like they've been talking to their mom, and they're so jazzed up from this experience that they're like, we're not going to be able to sleep. And so the girls just stay awake in the kitchen until Frank comes home from work. And when Frank comes inside and he sees his girls are awake, it's like midnight or whatever it is, he's sort of surprised. But the girls rush up to him and they're like, Dad, you wouldn't believe it. We had this seance and we heard this tapping sound and we know it was Mom. Mom is with us right now. We were talking to her. Now, Frank, he's totally caught off guard by what they're saying, but he also knows his girls, they're going through this horrible time in their lives. I mean, they've just lost their mother. He can't even imagine their level of grief. I mean, he's obviously grief-stricken, but this is their mom. And so he's seeing his girls for the first time in what feels like a long time, looking really happy and excited, and they're telling him that tapping sounds in the house are their mother. And so Frank, he's not going to pick holes in what they're doing. He's not going to question, what's actually happening in the house. Instead, as soon as they tell him all this stuff, he just goes, you know what, girls? Of course your mom is here. Your mom will always be here. She will always be looking out for you. Your mom is with you right now in the house, I'm sure of it. And so the girls, they're so happy. Again, this was such an amazing experience. Their dad, he also agreed this is so good. And so the girls, they happily go upstairs to their bedrooms, and they go to sleep. And Frank, truthfully, after having this exchange with his daughters, didn't really think much of it. Again, he's sort of thinking that, there wasn't really tapping sounds coming from his deceased wife. This is just some coping mechanism that the girls are using to deal with this tragedy. And he thinks, you know what? It's healthy enough. It's making them happy. What's the big deal? And so Frank, he goes to bed. Over the next few days, the tapping sounds in the house would continue. And they were no longer just coming from the basement. They were also coming from the kitchen. They were coming sometimes from the second floor. They were sort of coming from all over the house. But the girls were the only ones who could hear the sounds. Every time they'd hear the tapping, if their dad was home, they'd call him over, but Frank wouldn't hear anything. Now again, Frank doesn't really believe that there's actually tapping happening. He doesn't think this is actually real at all, but he's playing along with it because, his girls are happy, clearly this is their coping mechanism. And so again, Frank's not thinking much of it. It's harmless. The girls are frustrated that he can't hear it, but again, it's overall still a very good thing. It's Mom. Mom is trying to communicate with them. However, after a few days, post-seance, as the tapping continued, the girls began to change their attitude about the tapping sounds. The first day, and over those first few days, it really did feel like a good thing. This is Mom. This is positive. This was definitely a good thing. But after about 72 hours, post-seance, the girls began to sort of feel frightened by the tapping, because the tapping no longer was really just coming mostly from the basement. It now started coming almost exclusively from their bedrooms at night. So they'd be laying in bed and they'd hear, tapping underneath their beds. They'd hear tapping in their closets, and it was frightening. And they would call their dad in, and he'd come into their bedrooms and he wouldn't find anything. But now, Frank, who previously had just sort of let this continue, this is his girl's coping mechanism for this terrible loss. Now he's seeing that his girls, they don't really think it's Mom anymore. They don't know what this is. And it's also disrupting their sleep. And so now it's not a healthy thing anymore. This is a problem. It's disrupting his girls' lives. And so Frank begins at this point, 3 days post-seance now, he begins telling his girls, hey, come on guys, there's nothing to be scared of here. These tapping sounds are just normal house sounds. You're overthinking it. There's nothing that's gonna harm you in the house. Mom is definitely here looking out for you, but she's not making those tapping sounds. You gotta let this stuff go and just forget about this stuff. But the girls, they're like, Dad, we're not making the tapping sounds up. Just because you don't hear them does not mean they're not real. And they began to tell their dad, we think the seance worked, but we actually no longer think it's Mom that's sort of come out of the seance. We think we unlocked a different spirit, an evil spirit, and now that evil spirit is haunting our house. And so Frank, at this point, he's like, guys, that's not what's going on here. You really need to stop. These tapping sounds are not real. They're in your head or they're normal. And so Frank and his daughters really began to fight over this because the girls, they know they're hearing sounds, and Frank's like, I'm not. And so they're really starting to fight over it. The girls, they're getting more and more frightened just being in their house, in particular at night when these sounds would typically start. And so fast forward about a week after the seance,